Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at a genuinely fascinating Supreme Court case, one that completely challenges some of our deepest assumptions about local government corruption and procurement laws. We often think that breaking a bureaucratic rule is just this automatic, one-way ticket to a graft conviction. But as we're going to see today, the law is actually a whole lot more nuanced than that.
So think about this for a second. Does skipping public bidding always equal a crime? Honestly, if you're like most people, your immediate answer might be a resounding yes, absolutely. But we're here to bust that misconception right open. We're going to unpack exactly why the answer to this question is, well, it's a lot more complex than just a simple yes or no. Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. First, the garbage crisis contracts. 2, the graft conviction. 3, unpacking the anti-graft law. 4, rule breaking versus criminal intent. And finally, number 5, the final Supreme Court verdict. Let's start with Section 1, the garbage crisis contracts in Binmaley Pangasinan. Set the scene with me here. It's 2010, and Mayor Lorenzo Mayagoba Cerezo has just assumed office. But soon after, in 2011, these incredibly severe typhoons and monsoon rains just hammer the province. We're talking massive flooding and heavy debris and garbage rapidly accumulating everywhere. It is a genuine, full-blown public crisis. So to deal with this, between 2011 and 2013, the municipality signs 21 separate emergency lease contracts for dump trucks with a company called MTax Merchandising. Fast forward a bit to 2013, and a local resident officially files a whistleblower complaint over these exact contracts.
Now, what's really interesting here is the set of undisputed facts that triggered this whole legal battle. We've got Mayor Cerezo, we've got MTax Merchandising, which is owned by a guy named Edwin Castillo, and we have those 21 lease contracts for the dump trucks. But here is the absolute kicker. Literally zero public bidding was conducted for any of these contracts. They completely bypassed standard government procurement laws. Not a single bid.
So you might be wondering, why on earth would they do that? Well, let's look at the local government's perspective for a minute. Dr. Cecilio P. Tirado Jr., who was the municipal administrator at the time, flat out stated there's the need to immediately collect the garbage that we're piling up. Multiple local officials testified that without swift action, the typhoons would have left the entire municipality completely buried in rotting debris. They viewed these contracts not as a choice, but as absolute emergency necessities. They had a massive crisis on their hands, and they needed trucks right that second. Moving on to Section 2, the graft conviction. Let's talk about the Sandiganbayan ruling.
So the case goes to the Sandiganbayan, that's the special appellate collegial court in the Philippines that specifically handles graft cases. And their verdict? Guilty. Guilty on 16 counts of graft. They actually sentenced both Mayor Cerezo and the contractor, Edwin Castillo, to up to 40 years in prison. 40 years! I mean, at first glance, this looks like a total open and shut case of corruption, right? You skip the public bidding, you go to jail. Simple. The Sandiganbayan essentially ruled that there was a conspiracy of silence and inaction inferred only from the surrounding circumstances and the party's acts. What that boils down to is this. They basically assumed that just because Castillo, the private contractor, collaborated in signing the lease contracts with the mayor, well, he must have been in on a criminal conspiracy to bypass the law.
Okay, let's hold on a second. Section 3, unpacking the anti-graft law, specifically Section 3E of RA 3019. To actually get a conviction under Section 3E of Republic Act No. 3019, you legally need to check 3 distinct boxes. First, the accused has to be a public officer. Second, they must have acted with manifest partiality, evident bad faith, or gross inexcusable negligence. And third, their action has to have caused undue injury or gave unwarranted benefits to a private party. This is actually a really high legal threshold. Let's look a little closer at that second step, because that's where things get interesting.
Let's break these legal standards down into plain English, starting with manifest partiality. The Supreme Court defines this as a clear, notorious, or plain inclination or predilection to favor one side or person rather than another. So what does that actually mean? It means the prosecution has to prove a deliberate, conscious intent to play favorites. It's not just a procedural mistake in picking a vendor while you're in the middle of a literal storm.
Next up is evident bad faith. Now, this requires way more than just bad judgment or taking a quick shortcut during an emergency. It connotes a dishonest purpose or some moral obliquity and conscious doing of a wrong, partakes of the nature of fraud. Simply put, you need malicious motive. You literally need to have an intent to defraud the government. And finally, gross inexcusable negligence.
This is defined as the want of even slight care, acting willfully and intentionally with conscious indifference to consequences. Basically, the breach of duty has to be flagrant and devious. Just skipping some paperwork or omitting a step during a disaster response doesn't automatically reach this criminal level. It has to be a total reckless disregard.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 4, rule breaking versus criminal intent. Procedural flaw or actual crime?
Here is the absolute core conflict of this whole explainer. The lower court, the Sandigan Bayan, assumed that no public bidding just automatically equals a graft crime. Boom, done. But the Supreme Court countered this completely. They stated that, sure, while no public bidding is indeed a procedural flaw, it's an administrative violation for sure. A crime requires proof of actual corrupt intent. Bypassing a rule is not automatically the exact same bin as committing graft. Legally speaking, they're entirely distinct concepts.
And what the prosecution failed to prove here honestly changes everything. Listen to this. There was absolutely no proof that the dump trucks weren't actually needed. There was no proof that the rentals were overpriced. There was no proof that a cheaper supplier even existed in the area at the time. And most crucially, there was zero proof of any dishonest profit by either the mayor or the contractor. So without these missing pieces, the prosecution failed to prove any actual damage to the government, and they entirely failed to prove corrupt intent.
And what about our contractor, Mr. Castillo? The Supreme Court pointed out something pretty vital. Merely signing a contract does not equal a criminal conspiracy. There was zero evidence that Castillo knew anything about the defective procurement process happening inside the mayor's office. You can't be part of a criminal conspiracy just by signing a standard business contract and, actually doing the work you were hired to do.
All right, let's wrap this up with Section 5, the final Supreme Court verdict.
Listen to this powerful statement straight from the Supreme Court. Graft entails the acquisition of gain in dishonest ways. Acts must be effected with corrupt intent, a dishonest design, or some unethical interest. That right there is the main takeaway of this entire explainer. You just cannot have a criminal graft conviction without proven dishonest intent. Taking a procedural shortcut during a massive typhoon cleanup is not, in and of itself, graft.
And because that dishonest intent was completely missing, the Supreme Court completely reversed the Sandigan Bayan decision. Mayor Cerezo and contractor Castillo were officially acquitted. So that tension we started with at the beginning, it's resolved. Yes, they broke a strict procurement rule during a crisis to get garbage off the streets, but they did not commit a crime in doing so.
So, we're going to leave you with this somewhat provocative question to ponder today. Where exactly do we draw the line between urgently serving the public during a sudden crisis and strictly adhering to rigid procurement rules? It is an incredibly delicate balance between local government efficiency during emergencies and maintaining vital anti-corruption regulations. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. We really hope this breakdown helped you grasp exactly how the Supreme Court navigates these incredibly complex lines. See you next time.